OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODALoop.com.
All right, I'm Matt Devost, and thank you for tuning into the OODAcast. Today, I have Alok Sama joining me, who wrote this excellent book, The Money Trap, which I recommended in my newsletter a few months ago. Fantastic viewpoint kind of on his career and his journey in life. And I think I really appreciated the fact that there's just a lot of I call it honesty and humility and humor. Don't take yourself too seriously along the way. It reminded me a lot of reading, maybe a Shoe Dog or Creativity Inc. or The Hard Thing About Hard Things, if you've read that one, where there's just that kind of, brutal honesty along the way. So I would love for you just to briefly give the audience kind of your background and your career trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, how far back do you want me to go? All the way to the beginning?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I grew up in India, sort of fairly modest middle class background, and I kind of anchor that statement with a metaphor in the book, which is, being middle class in India means seating fans rather than air conditioning. My father was a research scientist. My mother was a student, and this is India in the 1970s, 1980s, kind of completely cut off from the rest of the world, from the United States. I had absolutely no knowledge, awareness of the financial services business, Wall Street. I might have heard of Citibank, perhaps, but that was the extent of my knowledge about finance. And then, kind of almost by accident, met with a professor from the Wharton School while I was a student at Delhi University studying mathematics. And this gentleman happened to teach operations research, which is glorified statistics, I guess, at the Wharton School. And he's the one who persuaded me to consider coming to the US and applying to the Wharton School. And so I arrived in 1984, Ronald Reagan's America, kind of the greed is good decade.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate to end up at I think still is one of the finest firms on Wall Street. And when I say one of the finest, I mean kind of having steered clear of a lot of the scandals that have plagued most on Wall Street, most of its contemporaries. I'm talking about Morgan Stanley here, and did 16 years at Morgan Stanley, and then after that, briefly had my own business, and then landed at probably the most interesting period of my career, which is when I ended up being president and CFO of SoftBank Group, and rode alongside, I should say, a pretty wild ride, Masayoshi Son, the Japanese billionaire technology investor, and since that was so intriguing, kind of his arc up and down, and my own kind of journey, because a lot went down in my personal life through the 5 or 6 year period I was associated with SoftBank. That kind of made for an interesting enough narrative. So I decided to write the type of book I don't normally read, but if you've read the book, you'll know what I mean. I mean, it is it is a story. It has a narrative of the way a novel might, which I thought was kind of which is what got me motivated to write about it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do want to touch upon those. I think maybe the interview will follow a little bit of that arc.
Yeah.
I did want to ask about the years at SoftBank, and I'm reminded, I sold a company to Accenture and I started doing angel investing, and it was a modest exit. But I had fun, working and selecting the companies. I remember meeting with a friend of mine, Ron Gula, and I was talking about, well, I'm only able to deploy this amount of capital into these companies, and you're playing bigger. And he looked at me and said, well, there's always somebody that's bigger, right? That's kind of the trap element of the money trap, I felt like. But
Yeah.
at your time at SoftBank, there really wasn't anyone bigger, right? I mean, you guys were kind of at the top of the pyramid by way of capital deployed and investments that you made. Do you think that kind of, was good, or was it a burden, or, how did it impact your viewpoint on risk and the investments that you were making, given that you kind of were the largest players in the capital pool at the time?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a fan of using adjectives like good or bad. I think those end up being, as you'll appreciate, gross oversimplifications.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that that the scale of the Vision Fund. The Vision Fund was this gargantuan $100 billion fund that SoftBank raised in late 2016, started to deploy in 2017. And that fund was raised at the time when the total volume of venture capital in the United States was just under 70 billion. I'll give you some idea of the proportion. Very few people, even the biggest firms, the best known firms in the Valley, had billion-dollar funds. So in that sense, SoftBank was a complete game changer. Again, I anchored that with a metaphor, and it was like that big black monolith from 2001 Space Odyssey, and it was just like plonked out there on the divide in Sand Hill Road, and everything changed after that, right? I mean, funds were bigger, and Masa Son's vision was you got to give the man credit. I mean, the AI hype cycle began a couple of years ago in 2023, but Masa was talking about it 10 years ago when I first started at SoftBank in 2014. And that was a big part of his motivation in raising this mega pool of capital. Problem was he was a little bit ahead of his time. I mean, I think we're again at a period now where, not an exaggeration to call it, kind of the fourth industrial revolution, but where it's reasonable to think in terms of deploying that quantum of capital. And indeed, Masa Son is. But back then, 2017, there's no way you could have deployed that amount of money on anything that was remotely related to AI. And as a result, when you have more capital than can be efficiently destroyed, you deployed, you end up making mistakes. And the biggest one Masa made, which he acknowledges and kind of takes the blame as opposed to pointing fingers at any of his employees or even the entrepreneur. The biggest mistake was WeWork. I mean, the company went bankrupt and SoftBank lost in excess of 10 billion. So there was misallocation of capital, but look, I mean, that's kind of the nature of capitalism, isn't it? I mean, you never kind of get things going in a smooth line.
Sure.
I think broadly, Son was right. His vision was spot on, and amid all his whips and WeWork being the most prominent, he struck gold with Arm Holdings, which is this chip designer he bought for 32 billion. And his mark-to-market gain was, well, I haven't checked it in the last couple of weeks. There's been a lot of volatility, but his mark-to-market gain was as much as $100 billion on that.
Yeah, amazing. I did actually have Sebastian Mallaby, I think year before last, talking about the power wave in his book, which was another good book to read. Where the VC approach is to make a ton of small to moderate bets and then hope that you get the big winners out of it. But do you feel like with those level of capital deployments that you were making fewer but much bigger bets, or was there a banking on the future or a vision that was coming into play, or do you feel like it was kind of adequately distributed out like a traditional VC firm?
Well, there was nothing traditional about SoftBank, and there's nothing traditional about Masa Son. So first of all, scale. Kind of $300 or $400 million deals by the standard of the Vision Fund were relatively small, but in the venture world or in the world of growth investing, those are very large deals. Yeah. So everything was bigger with the Vision Fund across the board. I think WeWork is probably the most talked about deal, and I think most people are familiar with that, so might as well talk about it more. It's an interesting case study because that was a case of a company that really was a real estate company masquerading as a technology company. I mean, I think that was the fundamental flaw. If it had been always marketed, valued, run like a real estate company, which it is now, by the way, I think Adam Newman was onto something. It would have been a very good, and it is now, a fine real estate company. So I think some of the investments were made in companies that weren't really technology companies. Greensill, which is a provider of mainly supplier financing, working capital financing in the UK, it wasn't really a technology company. So I think that's kind of where things went off the rail a little bit. But again, through all of that, Masa made this mammoth 32 billion bet, and that's the man's talent. I mean, his big bets, his biggest, boldest bets turn out to be spot on. And that's not just one off. It wasn't like otherwise you might dismiss it, but he's done it time and time again. He's bet the company mega deals are spectacularly right. And I think people don't give him enough credit for that and dwell too much on the relatively minor mistakes, $300 million on a dog walking app, which is kind of cute and kind of, you can make fun of it if you want, but the reality is it's a minor whiff by relative to some of his biggest successes.
Yeah, you mentioned about him being too early. How did that impact the decision cycle at all? Was there kind of a sense of impatience? As you mentioned, in 2014, you didn't have the AI hype cycle, so he had that vision, but he didn't have the companies, the pipeline of opportunities to invest in. How did that impact the decision making within the firm itself?
I think the decision making at SoftBank is it's all about Son. Kind of while I was there, he recruited Nikesh Arora, who is one of the brightest people I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a few very, very bright sparks. He had a voice, certainly, but in my experience with SoftBank, decisions are very much top down, and Son completely accepts responsibility, accountability for decisions, good and bad. So, I mean, there was when he had that quantum of money, there is an eagerness, almost an obligation, particularly when it's other people's money, to put it to work. You don't want to charge people management fees and then just sit on capital. And to me, that's not always the best construct because Son's got a fantastic track record, but that track record, his technology investing track record, was built over a kind of almost a 20-year period without the pressure of having to deploy a defined amount of capital within a specified period of time. And I think when you have that, your decision making, your risk management tends to be different. And by the way, it cuts both ways. I'll give you an example to explain what I mean by both ways. NVIDIA arguably poster child for what's been happening in the markets in the last couple of years. Masa identified NVIDIA really early. In fact, he wanted to buy the whole company, and we could have bought the whole company for 83 billion back in late 2016-17. I couldn't do that because from a regulatory perspective, he was told that the political sensitivity, even at the time, now would be completely unthinkable, but even at the time, the idea of NVIDIA kind of being at the heart of the AI revolution being in foreign hands was just not going to be allowed by CFIUS, which is the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. So Masa ended up buying 5% of NVIDIA on margin, and he bought that in the Vision Fund. So when you're deploying other people's money, and the Vision Fund itself was levered, you bought the stock on margin, so you levered twice over. When you buy that in the fund context, you kind of tend to be, and the stock pops by 2x, you tend to be aware that, okay, I've got like almost an 8x gain. Shouldn't I be returning capital to investors? Whereas, of course, the right thing to have done is, and it's easy to say with hindsight, but the right thing the more consistent thing to have done, the strategy more consistent with Masa's ethos of technology investing, which is make bets on megatrends and then stick with them over a long period of times. If he'd done that, the returns would have been, 50 or 100x, right? It would have been truly, truly spectacular. As it is, 7, 8x, nothing to be sneezed at, but he sold out too soon. So again, being in a fund context is, it changes the calculus in terms of how you think about deploying capital and harvesting capital.
Mm-hmm. As it relates to some of those kind of visionary viewpoints on the market, you mentioned AI. Are there other examples that come to mind where he was way out ahead of the market with regards to the direction it was headed?
Oh, absolutely. Let's rewind to 1996. He bet on this company. All it had was, kind of a brilliant entrepreneur and a domain name. It was yahoo.com, right? $100 million in Yahoo in 1996. He saw the internet wave coming. he picked what turned out to be the ultimate winner. And at one point, not just Yahoo, Son owned somewhere between 7 and 8% of all internet stuff. So he called that right. He saw that coming. And then my favorite, he didn't get out in time, by the way. I mean, so he got crushed.
Yep.
Kind of talking about his stock declining and his net worth declining by 95% in 2000 and the year 2000 when the internet bubble burst. But then his comeback deal was equally prescient. I mean, he saw the smartphone revolution before the iPhone was launched, and he bought this company in Japan, Vodafone Japan. And he did that based on a handshake from his friend, with his friend Steve Jobs. And the handshake was that whenever you come up with something that looks like this, looks like an iPhone, Steve or Apple would give SoftBank an exclusive for Japan. And purely based on that bet, they couldn't really, you couldn't sign a contract because Masa didn't own a phone company. Steve, Apple didn't have a product, right? So just shook hands. And based on that, Masa bought a company, $20 billion, 90% levered. And Steve, the iPhone was launched and changed the world. And Steve kind of kept his promise. And on the back of that, Masa built this phenomenal company. So he's done this, internet, smartphones, AI. He's done this several times over. In fact, the people assume that SoftBank is a bank or a financial institution. It isn't. The origin of SoftBank, the name is a bank for software, and goes back to SoftBank's origins, which was as a distributor of Microsoft software in Japan. So that, again, was based on Masa's foresight that PCs would change the world. And he bet on computer software at the time.
Amazing. It seems like he had a good sense for the inevitable, right? With AI, knowing that the inevitable element was coming, and the iPhone not even being an announced, or admitted product. I mean, maybe it was in development at some point, along the way, and banking on there. From your personal perspective in being involved in these deals, I always like to look at kind of what were some of the inversions? What was something that you personally thought was going to be successful that wasn't, or maybe something that you didn't think was a great idea but turned out to be a phenomenal success?
I'll be honest with you, Matt. I mean, I don't consider myself a technologist. I've been, kind of cut my, I'm a geek, I'm a nerd, trained as a mathematician, as a finance guy. So I tend to analyze, I tend to slice and dice. I'll give you examples. First deal I did was ride sharing, and SoftBank at one point deployed close to over $20 billion in the ride sharing space. That included 7 or 8 billion in Uber, and owned pieces of pretty much every ride sharing company globally. That's not an exaggeration. That included Didi in China, Ola in India. One of the first deals I did was Ola in India, and I looked at the economics of that and kind of quickly concluded. I looked at it top down. You look at what Indians are spending, and this analysis I kind of looked at and replicated everywhere in the world. You look at what people are spending on taxis, how much of that might be ride sharing, and then you make assumptions about market share, and you go through that. And you quickly conclude that these businesses are completely, totally worthless. That was my analysis, and now most of them have turned out fine. And I remember Son telling me that, look, you're looking at it the wrong way, because there is a leap of faith involved. You got to imagine a world, and we're here today, by the way. You got to imagine a world where, the biggest, if you spend $10 on an Uber, $7 goes to a driver. And Son's point way back in 2015 was, imagine a world without drivers. And I don't know if you've had the experience of riding in a Waymo, which I have in San Francisco. It's a complete game changer, man. I've never felt safer in a car ever, right? And point being, if you get your kind of technology bets right, kind of people like me who kind of count on analyses and numbers frequently end up making the wrong decisions. And those businesses are, Uber stock is finally, kind of doing great. And it's not just autonomous cars. Uber, to be fair, has evolved its business models from not just ride sharing to kind of an everything delivered type model, right? And there's lots of lessons in that. And it's not just about technology; it's about business models, how they evolve, how they need to be tweaked. And it is actually the rule rather than an exception. You have to pivot and pivot again before you
Mhm.
get it right. Kind of your original raison, your original business plan in the world of technology is almost never the right one, right? But in this case, it was for Uber, for all these businesses, it was building that platform, kind of connecting riders, users, and then evolving from that.
Yeah. Yeah, Uber was super fascinating in that it felt like magic. Just through serendipity, we ended up getting early access because my CTO of my company, FusionX, sat next to Travis on a plane out to San Francisco, and he was talking about the app. And then I realized that as it was spreading, I would get frustrated if it wasn't available. So that would kind of, to me, would give the market trend around. Uh, Not only does it fit a niche in the market, but I was actually, when I traveled to cities that didn't have Uber available, there was a sense of frustration, like having to go back in
Right,
time.
right,
Um,
right. Exactly. Yeah.
are there traits from some of these founders that you interacted with that you found kind of contributed to success, or was each one unique as you dealt with and interacted with these founders at these companies that you were making investments in?
Yeah, I mean, they were unique. I mean, I tell you the trait that it's sort of obvious, but the trait that doesn't go down well is all entrepreneurs have a certain level of arrogance, a very high level of self-belief. I think that's almost a given. You have to have that, right? It
Mm,
takes a certain audacity to think that you can actually go out and make a dent in the universe, right?
sure.
But I think that people who've taken a few knocks before, who've dealt with failure, I think that breeds a kind of an essential level of humility and an understanding that you're going to need to be flexible, and goes back to the point I just made, which is your first business plan is invariably not the right one. You're going to
Mhm.
have to tweak it, and that means frequently listening to what your board members, what your VCs say. So I think kind of having that some level of humility, flexibility, I think is fairly fundamental. But look, I mean, the one thing you never want to compromise on, whether it's kind of the shining light in their eyes, as Masa says of Alibaba founder Jack Ma. You need that kind of spark, that special something. Masa calls it the crazy factor,
Mhm.
and it takes a little bit, an element of craziness to go out there and create these huge companies. So you definitely want to look for that. But I know it sounds contradictory, but ideally you want that blended with a level of maturity and a willingness to kind of acknowledge that you're going to have to kind of make it up as you go along.
Mm. Yeah, maybe the failure helps drive some of that persistence
It
yeah,
frequently can. Yeah,
and that spark. I'll have
yeah,
entrepreneurs that come to me and they're employed and they have a job and they'll ask, well, when do you know that it's time to quit your job and start a company? And I always tell them, if you have to ask me that question, the time is not right. If you don't
yeah,
feel it,
yeah,
if you don't feel
yeah.
that drive or pull of it, then you're probably not going to dedicate to it what's needed to make it
Yeah.
a successful company.
That's
Uh,
well said.
we focus, the name of this podcast is the OODAcast. Are you familiar with the OODA Loop kind of decision-making cycle?
No, I'm
You're not?
not.
Okay.
No.
I'll give you the quick kind of 30-second summary. There was a fighter pilot named Colonel John Boyd that was a kind of undefeated dogfighter, including in Top Gun competitions against his own fighter pilots in the United States. So much so that he actually could start from a position of disadvantage, and then within 40 seconds, he could put himself in a position of advantage to win the dogfight. As you can imagine, that attracted the attention of the Department of Defense, and they brought him back to Washington, D.C. and said, we want to understand what makes you tick. And he came up with, at its simplest terms, that he participates in this decision-making cycle that he called the OODA Loop, that stood for observe, orient, decide, act. And he says he's just kind of iteratively in that loop, and that he executes it much more faster than his competitors. So I always like to ask folks, especially that have been in successful entrepreneurship journeys or in companies, do you have a mechanism or framework that you've developed over time that contributes to your decision making? You talked about being kind of numbers based, but are there other elements that you've brought into focus over the course of your career?
Um, I personally don't, and in all humility, I have to say I've never been the one to kind of identify either technology mega trends or entrepreneurs, but I can certainly share with you what I learned from working alongside someone who's kind of acknowledged as one of the goats of doing exactly that, right?
Yeah.
And I think for Masa, it goes back to this what he describes as this crazy factor, right? I mean, kind of looking for people who truly are committed to, almost delusional in terms of their commitment to making a dent in the universe. That literally is what he looks for, people who he thinks will change the world. His corporate mission is happiness for everyone, which sounds kind of weird, but there is an element of idealism in a kind of the Thomas Edison light bulb kind of ethos of technology and how it improves people's lives. So it's kind of those combination of things that he looks for. And by the way, there is also a somewhat Machiavellian kind of canny element to that craziness because he cultivates that a little bit because to the extent that everyone thinks you're crazy, and particularly if you've got a huge quantum of kind of a capital cannon, as someone described it, behind you, you don't want to mess with this guy. You don't want to mess with a crazy guy. You sure as hell don't want to mess with a crazy guy with 100 billion, right? So kind of those are some of the things that have served him well, along with the this uncanny ability to peer around corners and identify mega trends. And I know there's not a whole lot you can actually learn from that because I would never encourage anyone to copy Son because he's one of a
Yeah.
kind in terms of kind of calling these trends right. But I tell you what you can learn from him is his self-belief and the number of times he has been written off, pilloried, laughed at, made fun of in the media, and his comeback is really quite amazing.
Mhm.
And that is really, really special. And I think we can all learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. How did he identify, or the team identify the kind of the pipeline of opportunities, the crazy people to talk with? Because it seems to me like some of them will self-present, but it's not like a traditional investor pipeline. Like, what kind of strategies did he use to get exposure to those types of entrepreneurs?
Well, again, he got in early, right? So he's had this reputation. So in a sense, they've always come to him,
To come
right?
into him,
So,
okay.
kind of it started way before I was involved. It
Mhm.
started back in before the millennium in the 90s, it started with the internet, right? And since then, he's kind of been out there and has cultivated this, well, he's earned this, not just cultivated this aura of being the go-to man who if you had a crazy idea you wanted to sell to and you wanted to have someone to kind of be all in, back you with capital, he was your man. And Sam Altman did that. Sam could go to anyone he wanted to and raise as much capital as he wanted to, but Sam has chosen to ally himself to Masa Son, and
Mhm.
which to me is interesting. Why? Because Masa is writing huge checks, and his belief, his willingness to say, Sam, you're my man, I trust you, and I'm going to give you kind of more flexibility than what probably any other VC would allow you from an operational perspective. I think that's pretty cool. So they tend to come to him for exactly those reasons.
Yeah. So kind of a capital without constraints element to it.
Yes, yeah,
Because it did
yeah.
get that sense that it's not an overbearing type firm
Not at all.
with
Not at all.
regards to the
No,
oversight of the companies. You're
that's
making
not his.
bets on the entrepreneurs.
That's not his style. That's not his style. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as it relates to your own journey, in telling the story of this book, obviously, fascinating experiences. We could talk about stories about being at SoftBank or other elements of your career for hours, I'm sure. But take us through the arc in that, the book is titled The Money Trap, I'm sure, rather deliberately after reading it. And it seems like in your journey, you kind of came to a realization around the value or the detriments of that kind of constant pursuit and starting to reprioritize other elements of your life. So can you step us through that kind of arc or journey in the book for you personally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the title, by the way, is meant to, I'm sure you got that, meant to rhyme with honey trap, and there is
Hmm.
actually an attempted sexual blackmail in the book too. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think the most people in their 40s, even 50s, or on Wall Street, even some in the Valley, kind of know exactly what I'm talking about, which is you just get caught up in this cycle of bonuses, bigger bonuses, money, more money. And it's kind of you're in this cozy, enveloping bubble, and it's just really, really difficult to break away. And that's a little bit of what I was trying to capture. And what you allude to is also totally spot on. I mean, in the book, I one of the criticisms of the book, criticism slash observation, is I'm very open talking about luxury, about flying private or
Mhm.
$5,000 bottles of wine. And people kind of forget that when a writer does that, it's a conscious choice. You can write about whatever you want. You've got
Mhm.
editors, people who read the books, and they help you think about what should be in, what should be left out. So if I left those things in, if I chose to kind of be in your face about it, I did so with a reason because it was meant to be. It's not a popularity contest. It's meant to be a very honest book. So I just kind of wore it. I put it out there. Absolutely, I was as caught up as the next guy in it. It's just very difficult not to get caught up. And candidly, people who are not flying private probably haven't done it. It is very cool, right? So there's that element of it, but I always do that with an underlying postscript. And I'll give you an example of flying private. I described that in a lot of detail. I talk about how cool it was, how I felt like a rock star, I felt like Jagger. But then I make the point that as cool as this was, this plane had a G5 at my disposal. It was a hand-me-down from my boss, who had a G6, and he has a G7. So, kind of that whole cycle of there's always something better. It just never ends. Right. And if you're in New York, you'll know what I mean. I mean, there's always a bigger apartment closer to the park, or if you're in the Hamptons, there's always a house closer to the water and eventually the waterfront, right? It is, it's insanity. And anyone who's kind of wedded to that cycle, you're never going to be happy. And that's a little bit of what I was trying to capture. I mean, I'm not big on books that have messages, but that's certainly what is implied by the title, and it's deliberate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd love to pull on that thread a little bit more because it also seemed also, that it was personally driven, right? With regards to in that pursuit of money, there are things that you don't do by way of time, and in particular time with loved ones. So can you
Yeah.
pull on that element of it as well that was part of your journey and this realization or the reference to the money trap or constantly pursuing that kind of next big thing?
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate in as much as, I've been married almost 40 years and my wife's been an absolute pillar. And I was fortunate that I broke away from Morgan Stanley and kind of reconnected with my family. So I don't think I paid the price, though there definitely is a price to pay, as I'm sure you've seen too, Matt, in terms of being wedded to that cycle. I tell you what I do feel beyond redemption. is I did disconnect with my parents, and one of my big regrets, and this is one of those classic stories. I lost both my parents, and that's part of what I talk about in the book.
Mm.
Is it's little things like not having made enough time for my parents. It's as simple as not having called my mother most often. Um, while knowing how happy it made her. It's regrets like that time is gone and you can never recover. And people often ask me, what messages do you want to give to people? And for me, it literally is as simple as call your mother more often. Maybe go to your kids' soccer games. It's little things like that, right? That is the price you pay.
Mm. I did enjoy the parts in the book where you gave the insight into the relationship with your wife and even the role she was playing in your career, driving down the road in the car, taking these phone calls or helping out with that element of it. Because I do feel like that part gets kind of overshadowed. Myself as well, I've only been married for 25 years, but the spouse plays a critical role in success, right? In that pursuit
Absolutely.
of success. So,
Absolutely. If you've been married 25 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about, man. I mean, that is such a huge piece of your life. And if you have a happy, a stable equilibrium, then that kind of gives you energy that you can direct more productively and elsewhere, because there's just nothing like a kind of an energy sucking dynamic, stress dynamic at home. If you have that and more of that at work, and man, I mean, you're gonna hit a wall.
mm. Absolutely. So in the course of that journey, I mean, do you feel like you hit a wall, or what was the ultimate catalyst for you in,
But
leaving to write the book and, taking folks on kind of this shared journey with you through the telling of the story?
yeah, so I've always had this kind of itch, plus they call it a closet ambition. I wanted to write. So
Mm,
even in my last couple of years at SoftBank, I was looking at these, 2-year MFA degrees. I wanted to be in New York and ended up applying to Columbia and NYU.
mm,
And I wanted to write. I wasn't sure exactly what I'd end up writing. I am right now working on a work of fiction, which I'm really enjoying. And I ended up writing this book because not because I had a message I wanted to get across, but more it was fed back to me that nobody had actually read anything written with a writerly eye for observation from someone who'd actually been in these bizarre situations I'd been in, kind of deals of that magnitude in the room with CEOs, whether it's dinner with Mark Zuckerberg or meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, etc. So it is that's a little bit of what I was trying to capture. And my departure was a function of being caught up in one, just not having had enough time to grieve, having lost both my parents in a very short period of time, lost my dog too. And for people who have pets, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. That
mm,
can be really traumatic. And all of that happening in a short period of time. And equally, this bizarre smear campaign, which was, kind of like a mad dog snapping at my heels, which I then talk about in the book. It kind of permeates the story. Combination of that, and you kind of very quickly conclude that, man, life really is too short. I mean, I've just witnessed both my parents go, and lots of regrets there. And there are things I want to do that I want to get out of my system, right? I mean, it's your classic, it's your old cliche. You're never going to regret not having made an extra $1 million when you're on your deathbed. But kind of, you're going to wonder if I could have been a writer, if I could have done something a little bit different. You got to get that out of your system. So that's a lot of what drove my thinking when I left.
mm. Yeah. Well, you're good at it. I mean, a lot of people have great stories to tell from the business world, but I enjoyed not only the business element, but the personal journey. But you're
Yeah.
you're a good writer. As I said, I read a lot of books, and I found myself, ending some of the chapters where you introduce a bit of humor with like, big smile. So it wasn't kind of the cliffhanger. It was there was like a joyous component to it. So I certainly appreciated that.
Thank
Um,
you. Mhm.
can you speak a little bit to, you've mentioned a couple of times now, this kind of smear campaign? I mean, almost provides a corporate espionage like backdrop to the book. Can you take us through kind of the background on that and your experience dealing with that as you were running this big investment company?
Yeah, I mean, look, the book is, Matt, it starts with me in London at the Claridge's Hotel in Mayfair, meeting, if you can believe it, two Mossad agents who claimed that they could get me and reveal to me who was behind this smear campaign. But yeah, I mean, so the smear campaign is, and it's been kind of in the media a fair bit, is targeted not just me, but my former boss and good friend, the very brilliant Nikesh Arora, who's gone on to be chairman and CEO of Palo Alto Networks, has been spectacularly successful at that, by the way. And so someone started off writing letters to the board with all kinds of fabricated stories, kind of half truths, planting kind of fake news, and there is regrettably, particularly in India, the accountability when it comes to kind of the irresponsibility in terms of publishing stories completely half baked is just astounding. So planting stories like that, writing letters, trying to undermine us, anonymous letters delivered to my doorstep, basically saying, yeah, resign or else we'll do this, kind of completely empty threats. And it was surreal. I mean, the Wall Street Journal ran a front page story pointing a finger at someone, and I'm not going to say more because that wouldn't be reasonable because I don't have any proof. But to me, I know for some readers, it's a little bit frustrating that kind of set it up and then I don't actually tell you who's behind it or who did it or why he or she did it. And to which I have a twofold response, which is if I'd done it, then the book would have been about settling scores. And two, this isn't a book of fiction. I've just shared with you the reality I am living with, which is the ambiguity. You don't always get resolution. And that sadly is life. You just got to move beyond, right? I mean, in a work of fiction, you start off with a scene like that and you create an expectation that, okay, I'm going to deliver a body, I'm going to deliver a criminal, and, kind of people are going to have the satisfaction like an Agatha Christie novel of someone being caught and handcuffed and going to jail or shooting, themselves in the head, which frequently happens too. But you don't get that in reality, and it's frustrating. But life's like that.
Yeah, no, I did enjoy that element because it does highlight that fact that there are things that happen in life for which there isn't the resolution. I've had
Yeah,
similar experiences where I've been harassed and targeted and threats and things of that sort, for a variety of different reasons. And in some of them, you got granularity as to who it was and why, but with others, you kind of live with the unknown, right? So it's kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
always
yeah,
out there in the
yeah.
peripheral.
And
Um,
by the way, I mean, even without the resolution, I think it's still a bit of a message or a lesson, I think, for anyone who aspires to be in that world of money and power, which is, man, you'd better toughen
you're a
up.
target. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
a target, and
Yeah.
people do stuff that'll just blow you away. I mean, follow
Yeah.
you around, spread stories about you. Kind of, it's nuts.
Yeah. Do you feel like you were able to compartmentalize that, or yeah, how big an impact did it have, or how big a distraction was it for you
I
in
was
the end?
not. I was not. I was not very good at dealing with it, to be quite honest. It was. I won't say it destroyed me, but because it didn't. But I think my sleep suffered, my health suffered, so I did not deal with it well at all. And that, by the way, it is. And I'm glad you brought that up because it kind of goes back to your earlier question about the price you pay, and that certainly is a big part of the price you pay.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, any other lessons that you think that readers should draw from the book, or a favorite component of it that you feel like we haven't touched upon yet in the course of our conversation?
Yeah, the other there's two things I'd point to. One is the Economist had the critic there who reviewed the book had a very interesting description. This is not good or bad, but sometimes it's like the, kind of a statement that captures the essence of the book, and that's kind
Mm.
of weirdly satisfying. And I think they described it as a Rorschach test for readers. So what you take away from the book probably tells you something about yourself, right? And
Mm.
just to be specific on that, you could interpret this as, oh my God, it's so cool to be making all this money and flying private and, kind of it's purely aspirational. Or you could look at it the other way, which is, oh my God, I mean, what a loser. How vacuous is this kind of pursuit of money and all this stuff, right?
Mm.
There's enough ammunition both ways. And what you choose to take away, what resonates more, probably tells you a lot about yourself. So
Mm.
that's one. The second, which I do refer to, is I'm not religious, but I do talk about Vedic philosophy, which has this really interesting notion of stages of life,
Mm.
right? And I think we can all learn something from that. Stages of life, and again, it's a little bit sexist. It's coming from ancient India, and all societies were patriarchal, right? So it's kind of
Mm.
male oriented. But it starts with your days as a student, which where you're supposed to dedicate yourself to learning. Then you're prepared to you're supposed to go through a stage where you provide for your family, your wife, your kids. That's your responsibility. And then making money is a part of that. And then there is a third stage, and that's the really important thing that people lose sight of. There is a third stage where you're supposed to give back, right? Where you're supposed to gravitate towards kind of philanthropy and perhaps pursuing interests that you have. And then there's a final stage which is called sannyas, which is you renounce everything and you go out into the forest and you prepare for your passing on the next life. And there is just so much wisdom in that. The Vedas get a little bit prescriptive about at what age you're supposed to go from one to the other,
Mm.
but set that aside, right? I mean, I think it's like, pick your favorite cliche, 60 is the new 50 or whatever, right?
Mm.
I mean, or the new 40 even. But you decide, kind of where you want to plant those goalposts. But the idea that there is a stage when you're supposed to move beyond, it gets back to the idea of the money. That I think is a really, really important lesson.
Excellent. I appreciate that. And so at this stage, are you, if you look at your own life, you mentioned you want to write a fiction book. Is this your giving back phase? Like what other activities are you engaged in?
Yeah, I mean, like it's there is an element of giving back. I mean, I love engaging with students. I mean, all the money I make out of this book, for example, goes towards the renovation of Writers' House at NYU. I love that place.
Uh,
They're just great, great people, and I'd love to find a way to keep giving back in my own way. So I try and do that. Kind of engage with younger people a lot. The benefit of whatever I've learned, whether it's in their business or in their lives. I actually spend a disproportionate amount of time doing exactly that. Kids trying to figure out whether it still makes sense. Indian kids trying to figure out if it still makes sense to come to this new America. I don't want to get political, but you know what
mm.
I mean. I mean, it's
Sure.
a different world. So it is. I love spending time with people doing stuff like that. I haven't quite got to the forest stage yet because I think I've got enough energy to keep going to doing interesting stuff. In some ways, I feel I'm living my best life because writing it's self-indulgent. It's fun.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah,
Yeah, the interaction with the students, for me, I taught for 14 years at Georgetown, and then I've been teaching for 4 or 5 years now at Columbia. By way of disproportional impact, that's one
yeah,
lesson that I've learned is
yeah.
the ability to interact with the students at a young age, and then they go off and do their thing. It has an impact on like anything else in my life, from
It's really cool.
entrepreneurship or anything.
Yeah,
So,
it's very satisfying, isn't it? No, no, no. That's
yeah.
fantastic. I'm glad you're experiencing the same thing. Yeah,
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, my
yeah,
first class was 2002, and now I have a graduate of my class from 2004 building a company as a CEO in my startup studio. And that cycle is super fun as well to kind of see that
awesome. Yeah,
evolution.
yeah,
I
yeah,
do also appreciate that part of the giving back is taking the time to participate in a podcast like this, where, we're an unknown community to you,
yeah.
yet still being generous. I do just want to end with one final question that I ask everyone, especially given that you're an author, and that is, what is something that you have read recently that you would recommend to others?
Oh man, I read so much. That's a real thing. I tell you what, I'll give you one recommendation which I've given to a lot of people. It's not a book that's particularly well known. So I value, particularly for your community, hopefully this resonates. I value intellectual curiosity above all other qualities. In fact, even in recruiting, that's something I look for. Even in an entrepreneur, any startup entrepreneur probably should have picked up on this, is that's an essential quality, right? I mean, kind of always observing, always learning. And the book to me that represents the ultimate tribute to intellectual curiosity is by a German writer called Winfried Siebold, and it's called The Rings of Saturn. It's just a wonderful book. It's an unnamed narrator, which you assume is Siebold, going for a walk on the windswept, kind of relatively desolate um, northeastern coast of England, and he sees things, he observes things, and it triggers all kinds of streams of consciousness. And it's a book I reference in my book, but I think it's just a wonderful read, and I would recommend that very highly to everyone.
I love it. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. It is not often I get a recommendation on the podcast that isn't something I haven't already read or is sitting on the bookshelf. So I'm excited to go out and pick that up. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this interview. I highly recommend the book. I'll put the link, when the show gets released so that folks can go out and buy it, but a worthwhile read for certain.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.